Monica Lewinsky. She asked why a man impeached for lying under oath was now teaching the next generation about morality. In just 5 minutes, her words forced Clinton off the stage and sparked a national storm that split America in two. Some called her reckless. Millions called her the only one brave enough to break the silence. So what did Jasmine say that no one dared to say for 25 years? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The email arrived at 2:17 a.m. Subject line: Future of Ethical Leadership, a Clinton Global Forum invitation. The kind of polished, PR-heavy message her staff usually archived without reading. But this one didn't get filtered. It was marked high priority. Jasmine Crockett stared at the glowing screen in the darkness of her office, the only light coming from the monitor and the city's cold skyline behind her. We would be honored to have Congresswoman Crockett join our opening panel on ethical leadership, it read, hosted by William Jefferson Clinton. She didn't flinch, didn't blink, just sat there. And then, wordlessly, she opened the drawer on her left, pulled out a manila folder aged by years of quiet rage, and slowly placed it on the desk. Inside, the full 453-page Star report, Monica's deposition, the infamous stained dress testimony, notes scrawled in the margins from the summer Jasmine interned for a women's rights nonprofit. She remembered the way the instructors whispered about the price of ambition and how certain names were never questioned. She flipped to the page where Clinton's denial became national theater. I did not have sexual relations with that woman. She whispered the sentence aloud, not with mockery, but with something colder, the sound of someone sharpening a blade in their mind. For most, the invitation was a chance to be seen, to shake hands with history. For Jasmine, it was something else entirely, a stage, a trap, a crucible. She leaned back in her chair, exhaled through her nose like a fighter before the first punch, then picked up her phone. Her aide answered groggily, "Yes." Jasmine's voice cut through like steel wrapped in velvet. "Accept the invitation. I'll be there, and I won't be polite." Then she hung up. In the silence that followed, she stared out the window, watching the storm clouds gather over the Manhattan skyline. She wasn't coming to celebrate legacy. She was coming to question who got to define it. She wasn't coming to pose or applaud. She was coming to confront. As Jasmine Crockett stepped out of the black SUV and into the golden-lit lobby of the Conrad International in New York, cameras snapped like rifle fire. Inside, the ballroom gleamed with power and privilege. Senators, CEOs, academics, and journalists all gathered under chandeliers that had seen too much silence. This was a Clinton Foundation gala, elegant, controlled, and designed to celebrate legacies. Jasmine moved through the crowd like a storm behind glass. Her presence unsettled some, intrigued others. But no one knew she carried in her bag the full weight of history and the intention to release it. Bill Clinton walked onto the stage with his signature grin, easing the room into laughter with a joke about age and legacy. "We've got bright minds with us tonight," he said, then gestured to the panel, including Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, representing the next generation of leadership. Light applause followed, polite but thin. Jasmine rose from her seat, calm, centered. But when she reached the mic, the shift was immediate. Her voice was steady, but her words landed like thunder. "Before we talk about the future of ethics," she said, "let's be honest about who gets to define morality and who gets to escape it." The room fell silent. Clinton's smile cracked. And just like that, the celebration turned into a courtroom. The celebration had cracked, but now Jasmine was about to drive a wedge straight through its hollow center. The moment her voice cut through the glittering quiet of the ballroom, the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't just a silence. It was a vacuum, thick with anticipation and dread. Forks paused midair. Eyes darted, unsure whether to look at her or him. Jasmine didn't flinch. She stood firm beneath the blinding lights, a single figure in sharp contrast to the grandeur around her. Her voice was calm, but every syllable carried weight, as if she'd practiced them in the mirror 1,000 times, not to rehearse, but to remember. "Before we talk policy," she said, her tone controlled and clear, "before we exchange pleasantries about values and vision, I have to ask a question that doesn't come from politics. It comes from pain. She scanned the room slowly, not for approval, but for accountability. Because for decades, women like me have been told to move on, to be grateful the system works, to let power apologize on its own timeline. She paused, her breath steady. But does a man who was impeached for lying under oath, a man who denied, deflected, and dodged moral responsibility, really get to stand here today and tell my generation what ethical leadership looks like? Her words didn't rise. They sank, deep, like slow, deliberate stone drops into a still lake, rippling through every face in the room. A quiet gasp came from the left wing of the audience. One woman, mid-40s, perhaps, lowered her eyes. A young aide glanced anxiously at his boss. A reporter near the back muttered, "Oh my God," under her breath. The air was changing. Something sacred to this room, its need to pretend, was being stripped away. Then finally, the man himself stirred. Bill Clinton leaned back in his chair, lips parting just slightly, as if trying to calculate the cost of his response. And then it came, light, rehearsed, and meant to redirect. "That's a bold opening." He smiled as if it were still 1998, as if charm could cover up history. But Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't shift, didn't even blink. Because in that moment, she wasn't chasing applause. She wasn't here to entertain. She was here to remind a room full of survivors, sympathizers, and silent enablers that the past doesn't die in silence. It festers until someone finally dares to speak it aloud. The smile didn't work. Not this time. Not here. The room had heard his deflection. "That's a bold opening," but it fell flat, like a rehearsed line in a play whose script was long past its expiration date. All eyes stayed on her, and Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't respond with sarcasm or even visible anger. She moved slowly, deliberately, reaching down to the folder she'd brought with her, its edges worn, its contents dangerous. When she stood upright, she held a single sheet of paper between her fingers like a blade. Her voice was quiet but anchored, as if every word she was about to speak had been waiting, unseen, in the walls of that very ballroom. "They say we shouldn't bring up the past," she said, locking eyes with no one and everyone at once. "But maybe the reason it keeps resurfacing is because we never really dealt with it in the first place." She glanced down at the paper and took a breath that wasn't for her. It was for someone else. "Let me remind you what it sounded like when silence was forced and blame was placed on the powerless." Then she read, "I was made to feel like I was the only one responsible for the shame. Like I had seduced a president. Like I had wrecked a legacy." Her voice didn't rise, didn't shake, but something in the room did. It was the foundation of comfort, of denial, of history built on omission. "She was 22, Jasmine continued, eyes lifting from the page. "She was barely out of college, and she became a global punchline while the man she worked for, this man, kept writing books, giving speeches, and receiving standing ovations in rooms like this one." Her voice sharpened, but didn't shout. She didn't need volume. The truth was loud enough on its own. The media asked what she was wearing. Talk show hosts made jokes, but no one asked what it meant for a young intern to carry the weight of a nation's scandal, while the architect of it built his legacy in marble and applause. She paused, but not for effect, for control. She placed the paper on the podium like evidence in court. "People told me not to do this, told me I'd look angry, unprofessional, that I'd make it personal. But this is personal, for every woman who's been told to forget, to laugh it off, to move on, for the sake of someone else's comfort." Her voice softened, but her eyes didn't. "I'm not here to ruin anyone's evening. I'm here because we have built entire institutions on silence, and I am tired of pretending that silence is peace." The air in the room was no longer just tense. It was electric, painful, real. Jasmine had not only opened the wound, she made the entire room look at it, name it, and remember who caused it. She wasn't reaching for a microphone. She was reaching for justice, and she was doing it in the one place it had always been denied. The air had shifted. He knew it, and so did she. But men like Bill Clinton don't retreat. They redirect. They reach for the language that saved them in the past, the familiar script of reflection, remorse, and carefully packaged redemption. He adjusted the microphone with the ease of someone who'd stood behind hundreds just like it. His voice was steady, layered with age, polish, and calculation. "I've paid the price," he began, his tone low as if inviting the audience to witness his weariness. "I've made mistakes. I've reflected. I've learned. And I believe, genuinely, that the American people have forgiven me." A few polite nods echoed through the front row. He wasn't pleading, he was performing, and it was a performance he'd perfected. "I believe this nation has always been about second chances," he added, casting his gaze across the room like a grandfather reminding his family of grace. "I took responsibility, and I moved forward." But Jasmine wasn't here for the theater. She didn't nod, didn't soften. She took one small step forward, and when she spoke, it was quiet, but devastating. "Forgiveness," she said, holding his gaze, "is not the same as forgetting, and silence is not the same as redemption." Her voice wasn't rising. It was anchoring, rooting itself in a truth too long ignored. "You say you paid a price, but what was that price exactly? Losing public favor for a season? Facing tough headlines while still living in luxury? Speaking on stages like this one, where the only real consequence is someone asking a hard question you didn't expect?" She didn't blink. "The cost wasn't yours to bear. It was hers. It was every woman told to laugh off a trauma, to hide their shame so a man could keep his legacy intact." She glanced briefly at the audience, not to ask for their approval, but to hold them accountable too. "You got a library," she said. "She got reduced to a joke. You got book deals and foundations. She got a name dragged through mud on late-night television." Her tone didn't waver. It deepened. "And every time someone like me brings it up, you say it's old news, that we've moved on. But who is we?" She leaned slightly forward, and her final question was a scalpel. "Did you truly learn from your mistake, Mr. President, or did you just learn how to survive it?" The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was echoing with the sound of a myth collapsing in real time. The silence after Jasmine's final question didn't just hang. It lingered, like smoke that wouldn't clear. For a moment, it looked like Clinton might not answer. His jaw tightened. His fingers tapped the podium once, then again. But old habits die hard, especially for men who've spent a lifetime turning scandal into footnote and scrutiny into applause. He exhaled slowly, then leaned in with the calm demeanor of a man who'd faced storms and always found a way to make the clouds look like progress. "I hear you, Congresswoman," he said, voice steady but carefully measured, every word chosen like a chess move. "I respect your conviction, but I also hope you'll respect the truth that this country is built not just on confrontation, but on context." He raised his eyes to the audience now, not just to her. "Yes, I've made personal mistakes. Yes, I've apologized. And yes, I've lived with the consequences. But while we revisit the past, I ask you all not to forget the other part of the record." His tone grew firmer, his confidence returning. "During my presidency, America experienced the longest period of peacetime economic expansion in our history. 22 million jobs, a balanced federal budget, historic investments in education, healthcare, and technology. Crime rates down, home ownership up. We lifted millions out of poverty." A few heads in the room nodded, some from belief, others from instinct. He knew the rhythm. He knew how to build his defense not on denial, but on legacy. "I'm not asking for a pass," he continued, raising a hand as if to preempt criticism. "I'm asking for perspective. Leaders are human, flawed, and if we begin to measure their worth solely by their worst moments, we risk erasing the very progress their leadership enabled." He turned slightly toward Jasmine again. "We can't keep tearing down everyone who's fallen short, or eventually we'll find no one left standing." There was a pause. Not silence this time, but something more ambiguous. Unease. The sound of people wondering whether that speech still worked, whether it still fit the moment. Because while Clinton leaned on the story of what he gave America, Jasmine still stood as a reminder of what was taken and never returned. But Jasmine didn't flinch. Not when he listed jobs or deficits or legacy, because she had heard it all before. So had every woman who had ever been told that competence cancels consequence. That if a man delivers results, the rest, the lies, the silence, the damage, is just unfortunate background noise. She let the pause stretch, the tension coil tighter, before stepping forward with a voice so calm it felt like a warning. "We are tired," she said slowly, "tired of the kind of culture that rewards success with silence. Tired of this idea that if you build enough roads or balance enough budgets, then you've somehow bought immunity from accountability." She wasn't yelling. She didn't need to. Her words didn't explode. They landed one by one like verdicts. We've watched for decades as powerful men were praised for what they built, while the people they hurt were told to stay quiet for the sake of the greater good. She scanned the room, not for drama, but for reckoning. You say your presidency lifted millions. Maybe it did, but it also told an entire generation of young women that if they were wronged by someone powerful, they better keep their heads down. That speaking up would cost them their careers, their names, their dignity, that they would be laughed at, mocked, reduced to jokes on late-night TV while the man who humiliated them got to be called Mr. President for life. Her voice sharpened, not louder but colder. Monica Lewinsky wasn't an isolated story. She was just the one who couldn't be hidden. But I've spoken to others, women who left politics before they even got started, women who switched careers because they saw what happened when you challenged the wrong person at the wrong time, women who decided to never enter the arena at all. She took a breath, not because she was tired, but because the room needed to catch up. You say we shouldn't erase the good. I'm not trying to. But I won't let the good erase the pain either. Because when we treat legacy like a shield, all we do is teach the next generation that morality is optional, as long as your resume looks impressive enough. She stepped back slightly, but her gaze didn't waver. How many lives do we sacrifice at the altar of ambition before we start asking what leadership actually means? The room didn't move, because in that moment, it became clear. She wasn't speaking to one man anymore. She was speaking to a system, one that had let too much slide, one that was long overdue for judgment. But Jasmine wasn't finished, not by a long shot. Words alone had exposed the cracks. But what came next shattered the room entirely. She paused, her silence louder than any applause could have been, then calmly reached down and tapped her tablet. A soft chime echoed through the ballroom as the massive screen behind her flickered to life. The audience shifted in their seats, uncertain. "We've heard a lot tonight about growth," she said quietly, "about progress, about lessons learned. But growth doesn't happen without truth, and truth doesn't stop being relevant just because it makes people uncomfortable." The screen turned black for a brief second, then slowly a video appeared. The image was simple. Monica Lewinsky, seated in a plain chair, facing the camera. No makeup, no staging, just honesty. Her voice, when it came through the speakers, was tired, but clear, weary, but unflinching. "They told me gently but firmly that it would be better if I didn't speak again, that there was nothing to be gained, that it would reopen wounds, for him, for the country, and for me. But it wasn't really a suggestion. It was a warning, and it came from someone close to him, someone I used to trust." The words dropped like stones into water, one after the other, slow and heavy. The room froze. The polite facade, the legacy pageantry, it all stopped. A woman in the third row covered her mouth. A man near the back looked down, visibly shaken. Jasmine didn't move. She stood still beside the screen like a prosecutor who didn't need to argue anymore, because the evidence had spoken for itself. She let the silence stretch until the final echo of Monica's voice faded. Then she spoke, softly, clearly. "This was recorded 90 days ago, not 20 years, not 10, 90. So when we talk about forgiveness, about closure, let's be honest about what's actually being asked. Silence. Still. Even now." She turned slightly toward Clinton, whose eyes had dropped, his posture no longer relaxed but rigid, defensive. The confident hands that once danced across podiums now clenched faintly at his sides. He said nothing. For the first time all night, he had no line ready. Jasmine looked back out into the crowd, her voice steadier than ever. This isn't about punishing someone for the past. It's about protecting people in the present. It's about breaking the cycle, one that tells survivors to stay quiet for the comfort of the powerful. Her next words came without a hint of anger, only clarity. This isn't vengeance. This is truth, and truth doesn't wither over time. It doesn't shrink just because someone built a library around it. No one spoke, no one clapped, because this wasn't a moment for performance, it was a reckoning. And for the first time in that pristine, chandelier-lit ballroom, the truth was louder than the legend. The silence after Jasmine's final words was absolute, but beneath it ran a dangerous current, thick with history, ego, and the desperate need to regain control. Clinton stood stiffly at the edge of the stage, the mask of charm now brittle, cracking under the weight of something he hadn't faced in years, a truth too direct to disarm with anecdotes. His fingers curled slightly at his sides, knuckles whitening. He cleared his throat, not out of necessity, but out of habit, and stepped toward the microphone. His voice came low, almost calm, but there was steel behind it. Bitterness curled just beneath the surface. "You've said a lot tonight, Congresswoman," he began, trying to summon the gravitas of decades spent on podiums. "And I admire your passion. I do. But let's not pretend this isn't about more than truth." He paused just long enough for tension to ripple across the room, then narrowed his gaze toward her, like a man calling check in a game he thought he still controlled. "Because from where I'm standing, this doesn't feel like justice. It feels like theater. Carefully timed outrage. Headlines written in advance." His voice sharpened, not louder, but colder. "You've built a moment here, and I'm sure the cameras are loving it. But dragging up old wounds, spinning them for applause, doesn't make you brave. It makes you strategic." He motioned toward the crowd now, as if inviting them to see his side. "You weren't there. You didn't live through the decisions, the pressure, the weight of leadership when the stakes were real. It's easy to attack when history's already been written. It's easy to tear down when you don't have to carry anything." He turned back to her, the air charged with an accusation he didn't need to say outright. What you're doing, it's not courage, it's ambition." The room stirred uneasily. Some shifted in their seats, unsure whether to clap, nod, or recoil. Clinton's tone wasn't explosive. It was measured, surgical. But everyone in that ballroom knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't just defending himself. He was reframing her, trying to take her truth and reduce it to strategy, her rage to performance, her purpose to self-promotion. And in that moment, it was clear. The old tools of deflection hadn't disappeared. They were just being polished for one last use. But what Clinton didn't realize, what he couldn't admit, was that the ground had already shifted. And Jasmine Crockett was not the kind of woman who would let the truth be packaged, sold, and dismissed on his terms. But the attempt to reduce her to ambition, to paint her courage as ego, her convictions as self-promotion, didn't even graze her. Jasmine didn't blink, didn't shift her weight, didn't so much as exhale differently. She let Clinton's words linger like smoke from a fire that had long since lost its heat. And then, with the calm precision of someone who had spent her whole life walking through rooms that weren't built for her, she stepped forward. Her voice was low but laced with iron, cold, clear, and impossible to interrupt. "I don't need the spotlight, Mr. President," she said, each word articulated like a verdict. "I'm not standing here because I crave attention. I'm standing here because the truth has gone too long without oxygen. And every time someone finally pulls it to the surface, men like you call it ambition, as if ambition is a crime, but silence is noble." She kept her eyes locked on his, not with aggression, but with something more dangerous, certainty. "If the truth threatens you, that's not my flaw. That's your foundation cracking. If my words feel sharp, maybe it's because they're cutting through the version of history you've spent decades polishing." The room was silent, not because it was stunned, but because it knew, instinctively, that it was witnessing a shift, the kind of moment that couldn't be spun or softened. "You had your chance to tell your story," she continued. "You had books, stages, late-night interviews. I'm not here to erase you. I'm here to remind everyone what got left out. And if that makes people uncomfortable, then maybe we've been too comfortable with the wrong things. She paused, her breath steady, her presence unshakable. You say I'm exploiting the past for my own gain. But here's the truth. You don't get to define what justice looks like just because you survived the storm. Some of us are still drying off from the flood you walked away from. Clinton didn't speak. Couldn't. His usual tools, humor, charm, control, had no weight here. And Jasmine Crockett wasn't performing. She wasn't campaigning. She wasn't seeking power. She was power, sharpened by truth, standing in a room that finally had no place left to hide. The room may have fallen silent, but outside those walls, something far louder had just begun, a rupture spreading faster than anyone could contain. It started with a single post, a grainy screenshot of Jasmine at the podium, her hands steady, her jaw clenched, the words, "If the truth threatens you, that's your foundation cracking." Etched into white text at the bottom, within 10 minutes it had over 80,000 shares. Within an hour it was on CNN's front page. And within 2, it had crossed oceans, translated by users in Seoul, Paris, and Lagos under the simple caption, "She said what we've all been thinking." But it didn't stop there. It couldn't. What Jasmine had unleashed wasn't just a moment. It was a dam breaking. And the water wasn't just flowing, it was crashing. Students at Georgetown, NYU, and Howard began uploading videos, some standing in dorm hallways, some sitting on quiet library steps, speaking directly into their phones with trembling voices. They weren't political operatives. They weren't media professionals. They were young women who had grown up with sanitized textbooks and late-night jokes, now watching those stories finally bleed with truth. "I remember being 13 and watching the scandal on YouTube," one student said through tears. "They laughed. The hosts laughed. My parents laughed. And I thought, is that what happens when someone hurts you? You become a meme?" The video ended with her whispering, "Thank you, Jasmine," before she broke down and turned off the camera. On Twitter, the hashtags began to swell, at first scattered, then synchronized. Truth after power, no more silence, what she said matters. By midnight, they were trending #1 in the US, #3 globally. Young journalists, many of whom had spent years told to stay objective about the Clinton legacy, began to break protocol. A producer from MSNBC tweeted, "I was told not to ask about Lewinsky during my first internship. It's not relevant anymore." Tonight, I finally understood why it was always relevant. A former campaign volunteer from Hillary's 2008 run wrote anonymously, "I idolized the Clintons, but I also remember being told very clearly, don't bring up Monica if you want to be invited back." That was the culture, a gatekeeping machine made of silence. More stories poured in, and what had begun as a cultural moment began turning into a historical reckoning. Then came the statement from the 44 Collective, a private group chat long rumored to exist among former Clinton White House staffers. At 3:42 a.m., they posted an open letter. "For decades, we believed our silence was professionalism. We now understand it was complicity." The letter didn't name names, but it didn't have to. It detailed instances of pressure, quiet phone calls, canceled interviews, closed doors. Some of us were asked to discredit Monica. Others were instructed to help her move on. None of us asked if she wanted to. The document spread like fire. By dawn, major outlets like The Atlantic and The Washington Post had verified the authenticity. By noon the next day, TikTok had become its own battlefield. Videos stitched Jasmine's speech with reactions from women who had once worked in political offices, corporate firms, even churches. One particularly viral post showed a middle-aged Latina woman standing on her front porch saying, "I was an intern in '98. I was told by my supervisor, 'What happened to Monica will never happen to you, as long as you keep your mouth shut.'" That stayed with me for 25 years. She wiped her eyes and added, "I guess I'm finally ready to speak now." The video passed 10 million views in 6 hours. In a downtown Los Angeles cafe, a group of journalism students gathered, watching Jasmine's clip on a loop, whispering to each other between sips of bitter coffee. "She did it. She broke it. They can't shut this down anymore." Someone pulled out a whiteboard and began listing every public figure who had either mocked Monica or helped suppress her voice. Names went up in red marker. Some were crossed out in blue, those who had since apologized. Most weren't. The conversation wasn't just about Clinton anymore. It was about everybody who had used the phrase "move on" as a weapon, as a leash, as a shield. Back in Washington, the reaction was swift and deeply divided. Several prominent Democrats released carefully worded statements. Some praised Jasmine's courageous clarity. Others deflected with phrases like reopening old wounds and complicating the progress we've made. But even the safest responses were picked apart online, dissected for tone, timidity, or tactical vagueness. People weren't interested in neutrality anymore. They wanted truth. They wanted accountability. And more than anything, they wanted an end to the polite machinery that had made silence look respectable. In the midst of it all, Jasmine stayed silent for a while. She didn't tweet, didn't speak to press. When reporters surrounded her car outside her Capitol Hill office the following morning, she walked straight past them without a word, her expression unreadable, her posture firm. Some called it cold, but most called it power, because for once the story wasn't being filtered through pundits or PR agents. The people had taken it back, and they were carrying it forward without her having to say another word. That afternoon, someone noticed the Clinton Presidential Library website had temporarily gone offline. An error message flashed, "Maintenance in progress." Screenshots circulated, and soon a fresh wave of jokes, fury, and essays spilled across platforms. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. One tweet captured it perfectly. When the truth goes live, the legacy goes offline. By that evening, panels were being assembled on major news networks. Did Jasmine Crockett just rewrite the rules of political accountability? Can you separate personal morality from public leadership anymore? Why the Clinton mythology may finally be collapsing. But the most watched segment wasn't from a traditional network. It was from an independent live stream hosted by 3 college-age women who'd created a channel called No More Footnotes. They sat cross-legged on the floor of a tiny Brooklyn apartment, surrounded by handwritten notes, old articles, and copies of Monica Lewinsky's TED Talk. One of them held up a printed quote from Jasmine's speech. "Silence is not peace." Then she looked directly into the camera and said, "We've been told for years that this story was over. But we never got to decide that. Tonight, I say, we start deciding." The livestream crashed twice from traffic. By nightfall, major universities had begun scheduling emergency panels on ethics in politics and the role of memory in power structures. Professors revised syllabi. Podcasters launched emergency episodes. People who had been 13 when the scandal broke and had quietly absorbed its message were now 38 and finally understood what had been done to them, not just in front of them. Some of them were mothers now. Some had daughters. And they were ready to speak, ready to ask, ready to break the script. And behind it all, like a quiet engine pushing forward, Jasmine Crockett's name was no longer just trending. It was transforming something deeper. A shift in how history was told. A rupture in how legacies were shielded. Not because she shouted the loudest, but because she dared to speak plainly in a room where everyone else had been trained to whisper. Outside, the world was erupting, but inside the ballroom, time seemed to slow, as if history itself were holding its breath to see whether anyone on that stage would dare finish the conversation Jasmine had begun. Jasmine stood still, back straight, the light catching just enough of her face to reveal that she wasn't angry. She was resolved. She scanned the room slowly, not to provoke, not to taunt, but to make sure they heard her. Not just the ones in front of her, but the ones behind the podiums, the ones in the shadows, the ones who had learned to survive by staying silent, nodding politely, and applauding power because it paid the bills. She raised the microphone one last time, voice even, no longer needing force, just finality. "Let me be clear," she said, her tone so steady it shook the room more than any shout could have. "We are not here to burn down monuments. We are not here to rewrite what happened." She paused, her breath carefully measured. The crowd was motionless, still stunned from what had already unfolded. She continued, "We are here to remove the masks, to peel away the layers of polish and power and narrative that have protected certain men from ever being held to the standards they demanded from everyone else." She took a breath, eyes locking onto Clinton, who had stopped looking back. This is not about erasure. This is about exposure. And exposure, she said, letting the word hang, is what justice looks like when truth has waited too long in the dark. The entire ballroom, packed with former senators, professors, donors, journalists, seemed to collapse into one moment. Phones weren't buzzing anymore. No one moved. Not a fork clinked, not a throat cleared. It was as if the chandeliers themselves were listening. Then she said it, the line that would reverberate through history. "We did not come here to tear down statues," she said quietly, firmly and without hesitation. "We came to take off the masks." The silence was instant, total, not respectful, stunned. Every breath in the room seemed to freeze in place because there was no reply to that. None rehearsed, none available, not from the Clinton Foundation's comms team, not from the political analysts in the back row, not from Bill Clinton himself, whose face was now devoid of the practiced confidence he had worn so comfortably for decades. He didn't speak. He didn't look up. And then he moved, slowly, almost disjointedly. Clinton stepped away from the lectern. He didn't wait for the next speaker. He didn't stay to deliver the planned closing remarks. There was no call for applause, no gesture to the moderators, no attempt to reclaim the room with a final joke or one last hand wave to history. He simply walked off stage. The crowd watched, confused, torn between protocol and disbelief. Some instinctively began to clap out of habit, but it quickly died as they realized what they were witnessing. Clinton didn't even glance back. His staff trailed behind him in silence, their expressions a mix of panic and disbelief. The back door of the stage swung shut behind him with a soft but decisive thud. Jasmine remained still. She didn't smile, didn't gloat, because this was never about winning. It was about revealing. And the room now sat in that rarest of political moments, naked truth. No script, no pivot, just the raw consequence of a question finally answered. The moderator, a nervous man from a think tank that usually trafficked in polite policy debates, approached the mic, his face pale, hands shaking slightly. He glanced off stage, waiting for a signal that wouldn't come. We thank everyone for a productive and passionate exchange of ideas," he stammered. "This concludes our session on ethical leadership and generational responsibility." No one applauded. No one stood. The audience rose only when they had to, not out of respect, but from the quiet gravity of having witnessed something tectonic shift beneath their feet. Outside, the press pool had multiplied. Dozens of microphones and camera lenses now waited like vultures, but no one emerged. Inside the ballroom, guests trickled out slowly, not speaking, some holding their coats like shields. A few whispered to each other, but most kept their heads down. Some because they were shaken, some because they didn't want to be seen. They just watched a figure once considered untouchable become transparent, and found they had no language for what came next. Meanwhile, online, Jasmine's final line ignited like dry tinder, screenshotted, translated, etched onto protest signs. "We didn't come to tear down statues. We came to take off the masks." It became the cover of magazines, the subtitle of editorials, the rallying cry of 1,000 live streams. Young women printed it on shirts. Survivors posted it in bios. Journalists wove it into think pieces, and educators began using it as a prompt in ethics classrooms across the country. What happens when history is no longer edited by the victors, but interrogated by the victims? That night, The Atlantic published a headline that captured the moment. "When truth walked in, power walked out." The New Yorker followed with, "Jasmine Crockett didn't just speak, she unmasked an era." But perhaps the most telling image came not from a newsroom, but from a 19-year-old art student in Detroit. She posted a charcoal drawing on Instagram, Clinton's face half in shadow, with a hand reaching in, not to strike, but to peel away a mask made of newspapers, laughter, and statistics. Behind it, nothing, just a face, tired, older, human. And beneath the image, she had written Jasmine's words, "We came to take off the masks." It was reposted over 3 million times. Jasmine left the building quietly. No press conference, no selfie, no victory lap. She walked out the service exit, surrounded only by two aides and a silence far more powerful than applause. Her face was unreadable, her pace unhurried. A few reporters saw her but didn't shout questions. Somehow, even they understood that this wasn't the kind of story you could wrap in sound bites. This wasn't scandal. It was shift. In the car, her aide whispered, "You just made history." Jasmine shook her head slightly and murmured, "No, she did." She didn't say who, but everyone knew. The woman who wasn't allowed to speak. The women who were told not to look. The generations who inherited silence as a survival skill. They all had names now. Faces, stories. And tonight, one of them stood under the lights and said what none of them were ever given the stage to say. This wasn't the end of a legacy. It was the beginning of an unmasking. And no one, not presidents, not pundits, not donors, could stop what came next. But revolutions don't end when the stage lights dim. And by morning, the country was no longer asking what Jasmine had said, but whether she had gone too far in saying it. Sunrise brought no peace. It brought headlines. They hit like shockwaves, screaming from newsstands, pulsing across cable networks, multiplying with each click. On one side, praise. On the other, fury. And in the middle, Jasmine Crockett, suddenly the most polarizing woman in American politics. Did Jasmine Crockett disrespect a president or redefine accountability? Read Politico. The New York Times ran with a more careful headline, "A night that split the room and the nation." But others didn't hold back. The Daily Wire called her a performer with a vendetta. A Fox News anchor opened the morning broadcast with, "Is this what respect looks like now? Calling out presidents like they're criminals?" Social media was a battlefield of fire and fault lines. Clips from the night before flooded every timeline. The most viral segment, Jasmine's final words, "We didn't come to tear down statues. We came to take off the masks," was now part of over 14 million TikToks, stitched into everything from classroom discussions to protest footage to spoken word poetry. Supporters called her the voice of the silenced, a breaker of political theater, a reckoning in heels. Others painted her as disrespectful, calculating, too bold, too fast, too loud. Political talk shows didn't even try to hide the divide. One segment on MSNBC called her the only one brave enough to name the ghost of moral failure. Meanwhile, a panel on CNN spiraled into shouting when a former Clinton advisor accused her of violating sacred norms of statesmanship. Sacred, as if silence had ever been holy. But Jasmine said nothing. Not yet. She watched it all unfold from the edge of her own quiet. Her phone rang constantly. Some calls from allies, others from strangers offering security, speaking in hushed tones. A few networks begged for an exclusive interview. One former senator texted, "You burned down the right house. Don't let them shame you for lighting the match." But there were darker messages too. Emails with subject lines like, "Know your place," or "Careful who you challenge." One simply said, "Power has friends." She didn't flinch, because Jasmine knew exactly what she'd done, and more importantly, why she'd done it. But in the country beyond her silence, the split only deepened. Conservative outlets accused her of setting a precedent that would politicize every past administration. Liberal editorialists countered by saying the only people upset were those who had benefited from the myth of moral immunity. The Chicago Tribune called her speech a necessary bruise to a history too often written by those it protected. But the Wall Street Journal editorial board issued a biting rebuke. Accountability without humility becomes spectacle. Across dinner tables, people were choosing sides. In classrooms, debates erupted. Some high school teachers found themselves trying to explain to students what impeachment had meant in the 1990s, only to hear students ask why no one had ever explained what it meant for her. Others said Jasmine was reopening wounds. But students pushed back. They were never closed, just buried. The flashpoint moment, the moment that forced even the most neutral institutions to respond, came when a major university ethics department announced it would host a symposium titled, "When Respect Protects Power, The Ethics of Calling Out Legacy." It sold out in 43 minutes. In a quiet cafe in Atlanta, a group of retired civil rights attorneys met for their weekly breakfast. One of them, a woman who had marched in Selma in 1965, watched the recording of Jasmine's speech 3 times. Then she said with a cracked voice, "We fought for the right to speak, but no one told us how hard it would be when you actually do." Meanwhile, inside the political machine, panic and recalibration were underway. Some Clinton Foundation donors privately pulled back, asking for space before renewing contributions. Others doubled down, issuing public defenses of Bill Clinton, citing his lifetime of service and the danger of retroactive moral outrage. But among younger staffers, particularly women, murmurs of support for Jasmine grew. Some reached out anonymously. One aide wrote, "She said what I've been scared to even think for years." But perhaps the most jarring shift came from inside Congress. A junior representative from Ohio, previously known for staying out of controversy, released a letter of support titled, "Crockett wasn't dividing the country. She was showing us where the divide has always been." It was signed by 9 other first-term members of Congress by the end of the day. Cable news could barely keep up. One commentator, breathless, declared, "We are watching in real time what happens when history is challenged, not with rage, but with facts and a microphone." Another countered, "This wasn't bravery. It was showmanship disguised as justice. She ambushed a former president on his own stage." But that was the point, wasn't it? It wasn't his stage anymore. It had never truly been his. It had simply been built on silence, and Jasmine had finally pulled the rug. Still, the pressure on her mounted. In a closed-door meeting, a senior DNC strategist warned her team that the donors are nervous, that there's fallout, that some things are better left as they were. Jasmine's response, according to someone present, was simple. "So was slavery." That quote leaked, and it only added fuel to the firestorm. Protesters on both sides began gathering outside the Capitol. One group held signs reading "Respect before rage" and "Not her moment." But directly across from them, another group chanted, "Say her name, say her truth." Silence is the privilege of the comfortable. She didn't break the system, she showed it. In homes, on phones, in airports, everywhere. People weren't just talking about politics. They were talking about power, about truth, about what it meant to finally hear someone say the things so many had whispered for years, decades, lifetimes. For some it was a release. For others it was a threat. But for everyone it was undeniable. And yet through it all, Jasmine refused to play the game the way they expected. No apology tour, no victory dance, no late-night appearance to soften the blow. She simply kept working. On the Hill, in her district, behind closed doors where policy was still being written and battles still needed to be fought. Because she knew that what she had done wasn't a campaign stunt. It wasn't a mic drop moment. It was a mirror, held up to a nation. And people didn't always like what they saw in the mirror, not when it showed them the face of what they had accepted for far too long. And so the nation remained split. Not over Jasmine, but over what she forced them to confront. And deep down, even her fiercest critics knew the old world had been pierced, and it wasn't going back. While the nation argued over Jasmine's truth, another silence began to spread. Quieter, heavier, and coming from a man who had once filled every room he entered. For the first time in over 3 decades, Bill Clinton disappeared. No interviews, no speeches, no book signings. The man who had once been the gravitational center of any room he entered, the silver-tongued charmer, the comeback king, the master of narrative, vanished like a ghost. His team issued no press release, just a vague statement posted to the Clinton Foundation's website. Due to recent developments, President Clinton will be limiting public appearances in the coming weeks to focus on private matters and family. No further explanation, no clarification, but everyone knew what had happened. Because you don't need to say you're retreating when the world sees you flinch. The silence was strategic, maybe even necessary, but it was also deafening. Cable news anchors, who had once built entire segments around his presence, were left with nothing but clips and speculation. "Is this a temporary pause?" one commentator asked, "or the end of an era?" Another responded bluntly, "He was the architect of his own myth. Jasmine just removed the scaffolding." At first, the absence created confusion. Scheduled keynote at the Global Governance Forum? Canceled. Roundtable at the Aspen Institute? Quietly removed from the agenda. A guest appearance on a primetime CNN special about leadership in the 21st century? Replaced last minute by a former ambassador. Even the Clinton Foundation's annual gala, usually a red carpet event packed with celebrities and power brokers, was quietly rebranded as closed to press. A single reporter who tried to get in was told firmly, "This year we're keeping it low-key." Low-key, a phrase that had never once applied to the Clinton brand. And yet now there he was, or rather wasn't. Some said it was wise that the heat would pass, that the attention would shift back to the election cycle or the latest scandal du jour. But others, especially those who had spent years defending the man, were beginning to show cracks in their confidence. "If you've got nothing to hide," one op-ed in the Boston Globe read, "why run from the stage you once ruled?" Photos of Clinton began to surface, none official. One showed him exiting a townhouse in Chappaqua, head down, baseball cap low, sunglasses on despite the overcast skies. Another, more haunting, showed him at a small cafe in Rhinebeck, alone, staring out the window, a half-drunk cup of coffee going cold in front of him. The man who once held press conferences with hundreds of reporters now sat unnoticed by a generation too young to care or too awake to pretend. Meanwhile, his defenders began to fracture. Longtime allies who had stood beside him through impeachment, scandal, and political war rooms now issued carefully worded statements. One former cabinet member said, "We must allow space for reflection. That includes even those who once led." Another said more directly, "Legacy doesn't mean immunity." The Clinton Foundation's board released a short message praising his decades of service, while emphasizing that truth and transparency are at the heart of any institution that seeks public trust. It was the softest way to say, "We're not sure if we're standing behind you anymore." And while Clinton fell silent, the world around him didn't. Jasmine Crockett's speech was now being taught in communication courses. Her confrontation had made its way into legal ethics classes. A theater troupe in San Francisco staged a dramatic reenactment titled "The Mask." In it, the final line wasn't shouted, it was whispered into a room that sat in full silence. "We didn't come to tear down statues, we came to take off the masks." Audiences left crying, others left uncomfortable, but no one left unchanged. In New York, rumors swirled about Clinton canceling a long-planned memoir follow-up. Ghostwriters had been contacted. Editors were already brainstorming cover designs. But then the calls stopped. Deadlines vanished. One publishing executive, speaking anonymously, said, "He no longer owns the last word." Someone else took it. Inside Clinton's inner circle, frustration boiled. Some staffers felt betrayed, angry that he hadn't pushed back, hadn't defended himself more forcefully. One insider reportedly said, "This is a man who survived impeachment. Are we really going to let one woman and one speech undo all that?" But another countered, "It wasn't one woman. It was the whole damn country seeing something they hadn't seen before." The divide within the Clinton orbit began to mirror the divide in America itself. And through it all, Clinton remained unseen. His voice, once ubiquitous, comforting, persuasive, was absent from the Sunday shows, the op-eds, the fundraising circuits. No sharp defense, no careful pivot, just absence. It was as if, for the first time, he had nothing left to say. For Jasmine, the silence wasn't a victory, it was a consequence. And consequences weren't satisfying. They were inevitable. "People keep asking me how I feel now that he's gone quiet," she told one confidant. "But the truth is, it's not about him going quiet. It's about the fact that it took this long." She paused, then added, "Silence can be power, but silence after exposure? That's not strength. That's surrender." Outside political circles, the symbolism wasn't lost. Editorial cartoons showed statues with their faces removed. Editorials began describing Clinton not as America's comeback kid, but as a symbol of a generation that mistook charm for accountability. His supporters still existed, but even they had less to say. The narrative had shifted, not violently, not quickly, but permanently. When asked about his retreat, one journalist on PBS NewsHour said it best. This isn't about cancellation. This is about consequence. And for the first time, maybe ever, Bill Clinton is living in a moment where his words can't outpace the truth anymore. But as Clinton faded into the shadows, power did what it always does when threatened. It didn't disappear, it regrouped. And this time it summoned Jasmine to answer for the fire she had started. The invitation came sealed in an envelope too thick to be casual, delivered not by email or staffer, but by a congressional courier, an old-fashioned gesture designed for one thing: intimidation. Jasmine opened it at her desk, flanked by aides who had grown used to high-stakes schedules and viral headlines. But even they fell quiet as her eyes moved across the page. It wasn't a request, it was a summons. The House Committee on Ethics was convening an emergency hearing, officially, to evaluate the evolving standards for moral leadership and public re-engagement by former elected officials. Unofficially, it was about her. The letter was polite, clinical, and dripping with coded restraint. She had raised critical questions, it said, and challenged precedent in a manner that merits institutional reflection. Jasmine read it twice. What it really meant was, "You've made too many people uncomfortable. Now we're going to put you in a box." They gave her 7 days to prepare. 7 days where the halls of Congress grew more silent when she walked by. 7 days of side glances, half smiles from colleagues who used to cheer her on, but now whispered in elevators. She went too far. She didn't need to make it that personal. You can't humiliate a former president and expect no fallout. The old guard had closed ranks, and this hearing, it wasn't about truth, it was about containment. The morning of the hearing, Jasmine stepped into the long corridor of the Rayburn building, her heels echoing like a metronome for judgment. The marble felt colder than usual. Journalists lined the hallway, flashing cameras like gunfire, asking questions not for answers but for headlines. "Congresswoman, do you regret what you said? Are you prepared to be censured? Some say you've undermined the institution. How do you respond?" She didn't, not yet, because Jasmine knew this wasn't a place for one-liners. It was a place where narratives were carved into stone or erased entirely. Inside, the chamber buzzed with a brittle kind of tension. The committee sat behind a long bench. 12 members, 8 men, 4 women, arranged in perfect symmetry, expressions trained into masks of impartial concern. The chair, a veteran representative known more for backroom deals than ethical vision, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "Congresswoman Crockett, thank you for joining us today. We appreciate your willingness to participate in this important discussion." Jasmine sat at the witness table, alone. No counsel, no staff, just a single binder, a glass of water, and the kind of resolve that couldn't be coached. She leaned into the mic, her voice calm, measured. "I'm here because you asked about ethical limits for former leaders returning to public life. But let's be honest about what this is. This isn't about setting boundaries for them. It's about setting boundaries for me." A few pens paused mid-scribble. A murmur passed behind the press row. She didn't stop. "What you're calling a discussion started because I questioned the morality of allowing men with unresolved abuses of power to re-enter the public stage without accountability. That shouldn't be controversial. That should be required." The chair raised a hand. "Let's keep this focused on institutional norms, Congresswoman." She cut him off, respectfully, but with precision. Institutional norms are exactly what I'm talking about. The norm of letting legacy outweigh truth. The norm of letting charm overwrite consequence. The norm of protecting power at the expense of those who were crushed by it. The room tightened. Then came the questions. Polished, passive-aggressive, designed to corner without sounding cruel. "Do you believe your remarks endangered bipartisan cooperation? Would you agree that there's a difference between accountability and public shaming? Is it appropriate for a sitting member of Congress to directly confront a former president during a nonprofit forum?" Jasmine answered each one with the restraint of a surgeon and the force of a thunderstorm. Cooperation doesn't require silence. Shame is not inflicted, it is earned. And yes, it's appropriate, because if morality is off limits at a leadership summit, then what exactly are we leading? Some members looked away, others bristled. One senior member whispered to the staff behind him, visibly annoyed. But Jasmine didn't soften. She leaned forward slightly, not to challenge, but to be absolutely clear. You want to debate ethics? Then let's start with the ethics of memory, the ethics of silence, the ethics of watching someone who has harmed others be celebrated for what he built, while those he harmed are erased for what they endured. One of the younger members, clearly uncomfortable, tried to pivot. Congresswoman, do you not believe in redemption? Her answer was swift. I believe in redemption, but not without repentance, not without truth, and not while the system still punishes the whistleblower more harshly than the man who lit the fire. The hearing was meant to box her in. Instead, it exposed the walls. By the end of the second hour, the energy in the room had shifted. Some members leaned back, stone-faced. Others scribbled furiously, trying to reclaim control through language. But Jasmine had already redrawn the perimeter. She had taken a room designed to discipline her and turned it into a confession booth for a country terrified of confronting its own myths. When the chair attempted to close the session with a neutral summary, Jasmine spoke again, quietly. You can wrap this up however you like. You can file it under review, call it unprecedented, even write it off as a spectacle. But just know this, silence is no longer bipartisan, and neither is memory. The public is watching, and they know the difference between discomfort and injustice. The room froze. Then the gavel came down, not with finality, but with fatigue. Outside, the media swarmed again. But this time, they weren't chasing scandal. They were chasing a moment. And Jasmine? She walked through them with the same calm as before, because nothing had been taken from her. They tried to bury her with procedure, and she used it to dig up the truth. As Jasmine left the chamber, the weight of what she'd done wasn't just political, it was personal. And what lingered in the air wasn't noise or headlines anymore, but a single, unrelenting question. What does it cost to tell the truth when power teaches us to survive through silence? The lesson in the end wasn't about politics. It wasn't even about Clinton. It was about how systems survive by grooming good people into believing that morality is only dangerous when spoken aloud. Jasmine Crockett didn't dismantle an institution. She dared to reveal what had been festering beneath its polished floors. And for that, she was challenged, discredited, and nearly broken. But in refusing to apologize for discomfort, she did something few ever have the courage to do. She reminded the nation that silence is not the same as healing, and legacy is not the same as virtue. Real leadership doesn't hide behind nostalgia. It confronts the truth, even when the room isn't ready to hear it. We are taught that power earns forgiveness, that influence buys grace, that the higher a man climbs, the more insulated he becomes from the consequences of the pain he leaves behind. But Jasmine's story tore that script in half. She did not yell, she did not smear. She stood, and that was the rebellion. In a country still terrified of confronting the monsters it once celebrated, she showed that unmasking isn't destruction, it's liberation. Not just for the victims we remember, but for the history we're still writing. Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. It began as Ellen DeGeneres' grand return, a talk show framed around forgiveness, image repair, and carefully chosen words. But when Jasmine Crockett stepped on stage, she didn't play along. She confronted Ellen about years of workplace abuse, mental health denial, and racial exclusion. Ellen expected a soft interview. What she got was a brutal cross-examination in front of the nation. Their clash turned a redemption story into a public reckoning that no PR team could control. But the moment that changed everything, what exactly did Jasmine say? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. For 2 long years, Ellen DeGeneres vanished from the spotlight. Her once beloved daytime throne now a scorched battlefield of controversy. The woman who once danced into millions of living rooms had retreated into silence, leaving behind a crater of broken trust and whispered confessions. Now, in a bold and highly publicized return, she unveiled her latest project. Redemption with Ellen, a glossy primetime talk show billed as a platform for healing, forgiveness, and moral reflection. But beneath the soft lighting and carefully curated apology tours, the press knew what this really was: a rebranding, a second act for someone whose first had ended in disgrace. Ellen's team needed credibility. They needed fire. They needed someone whose presence alone would ignite national conversation. So they reached for Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. The invitation was worded with strategic vagueness. "We'd be honored to have you as our first guest to discuss public accountability and grace after hardship." Jasmine read it twice, then slid her phone across the table in silence. Her chief of staff, Malik, narrowed his eyes. "They want you to humanize her," he said flatly. Jasmine didn't respond, but the air around her sharpened. She remembered 2020, not just the headlines, but the unseen faces behind them. The young black assistant producer who said she cried in the bathroom for months. The editor who was told not to mention their anxiety, or they'd be seen as unreliable. And then there was Ellen, smiling through it all, issuing blanket apologies while three scapegoats took the fall. Jasmine didn't need a chair on Ellen's show. She needed a reckoning. She declined. Politely, firmly. But 3 days later, a revised offer came, this time with a quote from Ellen herself. "We want to hear from those who feel silenced by media systems. We want Jasmine to speak her truth." That phrasing shifted everything. Jasmine wasn't being asked to nod along. She was being handed the mic on national television. But this wasn't about revenge. This was about justice. She turned to Malik and said, "Tell them I'll do it, but make sure they understand. I'm not coming to talk. I'm coming to ask the questions their viewers have been screaming into silence for years." Then she leaned back, fire in her eyes. "And if she lies, I'll be ready." That night, long after the cameras were locked in and the stage lights prepped, Jasmine Crockett sat alone in her DC office, surrounded not by scripts, but by silence and scars she didn't own, yet couldn't ignore. The desk was buried in open browser tabs, BuzzFeed exposés, Variety timelines, Rolling Stone interviews with blurred-out faces and raw, anonymous confessions. Jasmine leaned forward, face lit only by the flickering blue of a laptop screen, her jaw clenched as phrases like systemic fear, unspoken retaliation, and her smile was a mask flooded every paragraph. The deeper she read, the clearer it became. Ellen hadn't just missed the signs, she had profited from their invisibility. Jasmine grabbed a yellow legal pad and began to write in bold, uncompromising strokes. Question 1. Why did no staffer ever see your apology until it aired? Question 2. How do you define kindness when silence protects abuse? Question 3. Who was promoted? Who was erased? She didn't write these for airtime. She wrote them like legal charges, deliberate, factual, impossible to dodge. Then out of nowhere, her phone buzzed. A direct message. No name, no pleasantries, just a sentence. "I used to work for Ellen." I know what she really said. Jasmine froze. Her thumb hovered over the screen. She tapped. A file uploaded. Grainy, clearly shot from a control room monitor. It showed Ellen, mid-conversation with a producer, her face hard. Not the warm, telegenic host America adored, but someone colder, blunt, dismissive. And then she said it. "If he needs therapy, maybe he shouldn't be working here." A cruel joke, tossed casually, off air but on brand for those who knew the truth. Jasmine hit pause. Her jaw clenched. Her heart raced. She replayed the clip. Not for confirmation, she already believed them, but to feel the full weight of it, the full weight of a woman who'd built an empire on empathy, weaponizing someone's mental health struggle for a laugh. Her phone buzzed again. Another message. Same source. "Please, if you care about justice, don't let her act her way out of this. Some of us still wake up afraid, still unemployed, still in therapy." Jasmine stared at the screen, eyes burning, not with tears but with clarity, the kind that comes only when the last mask has fallen. She closed the laptop slowly, stood up, and turned off the desk lamp. The room fell into darkness, except for one small light still shining behind her. The truth. and she whispered into it, steady and low. Tomorrow, I'm not going there to talk. I'm going there to break the silence. The next evening came with the weight of something historic, less like a taping, more like a trial. And when Jasmine Crockett stepped out of the car, the California air felt thick, not with heat, but with expectation. This wasn't just television. This was Judgment Day on a soundstage. The studio shimmered like a stage built for redemption. Every surface gleamed. Spotlights traced perfect halos around white armchairs that looked more like confession booths than furniture. The backdrop pulsed with soft, oceanic blues, calming, intentional, almost manipulative. Producers whispered in earpieces like generals on a battlefield. Stagehands moved with military precision. Every angle had been planned, every shadow eliminated. They weren't just building a set, they were building Ellen's second chance. Then, right on cue, she appeared. Ellen DeGeneres stepped into the light to the sound of warm, automatic applause. She smiled the way America remembered. Wide, easy, engineered to disarm. Her pale gray blazer was soft, safe, carefully non-threatening. The lighting framed her like a halo. For a moment, if you squinted, you could almost forget the articles, the investigations, the buried voices. You could almost believe this was just another comeback, another misunderstood celebrity trying to heal, but only if you weren't paying attention. She sat down, crossed her legs, leaned forward slightly, and delivered her line like it had been rehearsed 50 times. Because it had. Thank you for being here. I'm ready to face everything I've caused. There it was. Gentle, vulnerable, non-specific. The kind of sentence that passes as accountability when no one dares to follow up. The audience gave a soft murmur of approval, unsure whether to clap again or stay quiet. Ellen gave them the same smile she'd worn for 2 decades, only this time it looked like a costume. Then the second door opened. No music, no applause, no fanfare. Just the sound of footsteps, measured, steady, deliberate. Jasmine Crockett walked into the studio like someone walking into court, not a green room. Dressed in deep navy, with a blazer sharp enough to cut through pleasantries, she didn't look around for approval. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. The crowd didn't know what to do with her silence, so they stayed frozen. The difference was immediate, undeniable. Ellen had entered like a host. Jasmine entered like a verdict. She didn't sit. Not yet. She looked at Ellen, not through her, but into her. And for the first time all evening, Ellen blinked. Not because of the lights, because of the weight. Because Jasmine wasn't playing by the rules of daytime TV. She wasn't here to be pleasant. She was here to be precise. Jasmine took one step forward and spoke with the calm of someone who'd already decided not to flinch. Then let's not pretend, she said, voice low but cutting. A pause. Her eyes locked on Ellen's. Let's begin with the truth. And for the first time that night, the room didn't feel stage. It felt real. It felt dangerous. It felt alive. The silence after Jasmine's words wasn't just awkward. It was surgical. It cut through the lights, the set, the illusion. And then, with the calm precision of someone who had waited long enough, she began the dissection. Jasmine didn't raise her voice, but every word felt like it echoed through the bones of the room. She leaned forward, not aggressively, but with the weight of truth that no stage cue could soften. Her tone was low, steady, but her eyes didn't blink. Let me ask you something, Ellen, she said, her voice slicing through the artificial calm like a scalpel. Why didn't you ever apologize to those people? Face to face, not on a segment, not with a camera crew and an Emmy-nominated sound team. I mean really apologize. One by one, off air, human to human. Why did you turn their trauma into your redemption arc? She didn't flinch. Her words landed with intention, one after the other, like the sound of courtroom evidence being laid out on a cold, hard table. You had their phone numbers, their names. You saw them cry in the halls, and then you saw them disappear. And still, the only apology they ever got was packaged between a monologue and a dance break. Ellen's face, normally a portrait of poise, twitched. Her lips parted just enough to inhale, as if she was preparing to speak. But no sound came. She looked like someone who'd walked onto the wrong set of her own show, and Jasmine saw it. She didn't hesitate. She shifted in her chair, just slightly forward, and asked the second question with even more force, but no less control. You said you didn't know what was going on behind the scenes. That's what you told the media. That's what you told America. A pause. But Ellen, you weren't an intern. You weren't a guest. You were the executive producer, the host, the brand. Her voice sharpened. So tell me, do you honestly expect people to believe that you didn't know the people who were being belittled, humiliated, fired for speaking up? Are you calling that ignorance? Or is that just what accountability looks like when it's too late? The room felt frozen, like everyone inside was holding their breath without realizing it. The temperature hadn't changed, but somehow everything felt colder. Ellen's smile had vanished. Her posture was no longer relaxed. It was tense, guarded, like a boxer pressed to the ropes but refusing to swing. She reached for her water but didn't drink. Her hand trembled just enough for the studio cameras to catch. But Jasmine wasn't finished. She delivered the third question like a closing argument. Her tone didn't rise, but it deepened, carrying something older, heavier, like it wasn't just her voice speaking, but the echo of every name that had been left out of Ellen's version of the story. How many black employees ever had real power on your set? Jasmine asked. Not interns, not assistants. I mean producers, writers, directors, the people who could say no to you. How many? She stared at Ellen, unwavering. And tell me, how many of them were still standing when the scandal hit? Because we looked. And from where I sit, it doesn't look like an oversight. It looks like a pattern. Ellen didn't speak. She couldn't. The silence that followed wasn't accidental. It was earned. The audience didn't clap. The cameras didn't pan. There was no laugh track, no soft piano swell to cushion the moment. Just the raw sound of a set cracking under the pressure of a truth too long avoided. For the first time on Redemption with Ellen, there was no control, no edit, just a woman who had danced past accountability for years, and another who walked in with nothing but the facts and made the whole room listen. The moment felt like a fuse being lit in slow motion. Jasmine didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't even clear her throat. Her hand moved with purpose, deliberate and calm, as she reached inside the inner lining of her navy blazer. The studio lights reflected off a small matte black USB drive between her fingers. She didn't hold it up. She didn't announce it like a prop on a late-night bit. She simply placed it on the glass table between them with a soft click, like a judge lowering a gavel in a courtroom that had gone far too long without order. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It cut through the artificial stillness like a scalpel. This drive contains footage from your post-production room, she said, her words measured like closing arguments. Not public footage, not edits made for air. These were private internal tapes, sent to me by someone who worked in your building, wore your staff lanyard, and cried in your bathroom. Ellen sat perfectly still, hands folded, but the color in her cheeks began to shift. Just slightly. The audience leaned in unconsciously, as if pulled by gravity. Jasmine continued. In one of these clips, you're overheard mocking an employee who was struggling with clinical depression. In another, you're seen giving direct instructions to remove mental health leave from HR logs. She paused. Your exact words. Just get rid of it. We don't need that weak energy on set. A sharp, involuntary inhale swept through the studio, maybe from the audience, maybe from someone backstage. Ellen's eyes darted once, quickly, to the monitors off camera, like a swimmer checking for a lifeboat. But there wasn't one. Not this time. She cleared her throat. I don't recall saying anything like that. Her voice was softer now, not defensive, yet, but searching, scrambling for a ledge in a collapsing narrative. It doesn't sound like me, but Jasmine was already turning toward the control booth. Roll the tape. And just like that, the room changed. The background dimmed. The screens lit up. There was no theme music, no title card, no cue for the audience to clap or laugh. The footage began raw and unfiltered, time-stamped, colorless, pulled from what looked like an editing bay camera. There were multiple figures, but only one voice was unmistakably clear. Ellen's. She was seated, hair pulled back, laughing as she spoke into a headset. Her tone was dry. sharp, without warmth. If he's that fragile, maybe this isn't the right job. Her voice crackled through the speakers, louder than any amplifier. I need people who show up, not excuses in therapy form. Gasps didn't come all at once. They came in waves. First a ripple, then a shiver. Audience members leaned forward, some with hands pressed to their mouths. Jasmine watched them, not for drama, but for recognition. Recognition of the damage that so many had once dismissed as rumor, exaggeration, or just part of the industry. But the footage wasn't done. In the next scene, Ellen sat with a production coordinator, eyes locked on a computer screen. Her voice had shifted, not sarcastic now, but cold, flat, like a CEO reviewing budget cuts. Just delete those medical leave forms, she said. I don't want to keep filing that crap. People need to either be here or not. A long silence followed, not in the video, on the stage. The silence in the studio was no longer polite or tentative. It was stunned. And then, from the speakers, came the most human sound in the room. A voice, soft, cracking, a testimonial from a former employee. Her words barely audible at first. She didn't name herself. She didn't need to. I was one of the ones who filed a health leave. A pause. I had a panic attack in the stairwell, and no one came to check on me. Her voice trembled, choked. We used to believe in her. We thought she was different. Another pause. Longer this time. Then, now I just want to be seen as human again. That broke something. Not in Jasmine, she had already broken, but in the air around them. The audience wasn't reacting like spectators anymore. Some sat forward stunned. A few sat back, visibly uncomfortable. One woman clutched her handbag so tightly it bent under her hands. Even the crew, trained professionals, stood frozen behind their cameras, unsure whether they were capturing history or undoing it. Ellen didn't move. Her hands, once folded neatly, had slipped apart and now rested awkwardly on the edge of her chair, fingers twitching ever so slightly. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but stopped. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't sound hollow beneath that footage. Nothing that wouldn't collapse under the truth they'd all just seen. Jasmine turned back to her, not gloating, not vengeful. Her eyes held the weight of everyone who had never made it to that stage. You say you want redemption, she said softly. Redemption isn't a stage, it's a mirror. And today, that mirror finally answered back. The crowd still didn't clap. They couldn't. Applause would have been dishonest. This wasn't triumph, it was exposure. And sometimes the truth, when it lands too late, is too heavy to celebrate. The screen behind them faded to black, but the silence remained. And in that silence, for the first time in her career, Ellen DeGeneres didn't have a punchline. She just had the weight of her own words, played back to her, in a country that was finally, quietly listening. The room didn't return to normal after the footage ended, because there was no normal left. The damage had been done. But outside that studio, the world was just beginning to erupt. Within minutes of the broadcast ending, the first tremors hit Twitter like aftershocks. A short clip, just 47 seconds of Jasmine placing the USB on the table, surfaced and went viral before the credits had even rolled. By the time Ellen's studio lights dimmed, Let Jasmine Speak was trending in over 36 cities, joined almost immediately by a far more damning companion. Ellen knew. The internet moved like it always did, fast, furious, and brutally unforgiving. But this time, it wasn't a celebrity scandal people laughed at. It was a reckoning. A thread from a former segment producer gained 600,000 retweets in under 2 hours. She wrote, "She said we were a family, but families don't hide panic attacks. Families don't erase medical leave. Jasmine said what we were too scared to." By morning, the numbers weren't just digital, they were real. Major brands, some of whom had stood by Ellen through earlier backlash, began issuing vague but deliberate statements. Target, CoverGirl, Starbucks. We take these allegations seriously. We are evaluating our ongoing partnerships. Behind the scenes, legal teams scrambled. Marketing executives held emergency Zoom calls. Quietly, advertisers began withdrawing from the network's fall schedule. Internally, Warner Media leaked panic. Revenue projections were adjusted. Contracts reviewed. No one wanted to be the last brand seen smiling next to Ellen DeGeneres, Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett's name ricocheted across platforms like a meteor tearing through a carefully curated sky. She wasn't trending because of what she wore or how sharply she spoke. She was trending because in one uninterrupted shot, she had done what countless petitions, articles, and inside voices couldn't. She broke the narrative. She shattered the stage that had protected Ellen for years. What began as a single confrontation had evolved into a digital insurgency. TikTokers dissected every second of the footage. Media analysts called it the moment the media stopped protecting itself. One Gen Z creator stitched a clip of Jasmine's final line. "Redemption isn't a stage, it's a mirror." Over footage of factory workers, nurses, and corporate emails about unpaid sick leave. It reached 9.3 million views in a day. But the weight of the moment wasn't just cultural, it was political. Within 24 hours, two House representatives, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan Omar, posted side-by-side statements. Both featured the now famous image of Jasmine staring across the glass table at Ellen, USB in frame, truth suspended in the air like a loaded verdict. AOC wrote, "This is what courage looks like." Jasmine Crockett didn't just walk into power, she walked through it. She didn't ask for the mic, she took it, and America needed to hear what she said. Ilhan Omar followed moments later. "The most dangerous thing you can do to power is speak plainly in its face." Jasmine did that, and she did it for every woman who was ever silenced behind a smiling gatekeeper. Their words didn't come without cost. Right-wing commentators and cable news hosts launched into defense mode. Some accused Jasmine of ambushing Ellen. Others framed the confrontation as uncivil, disrespectful, or careerist. But the backlash, instead of slowing the momentum, only made it spread faster. Jasmine didn't respond to the attacks. She didn't tweet. She didn't give sound bites. She remained silent for 36 hours, letting the footage speak for her. That silence, that calculated refusal to engage in the typical media spin cycle, only made her more powerful. The public wasn't waiting for a follow-up. They were already rewriting the headlines themselves. A graphic began circulating with her face centered between the two hashtags. "Let Jasmine speak," in white. Ellen knew, in blood red. It wasn't just viral, it was visual indictment. And then came the flood. Over the next 72 hours, over 50 former employees from the Ellen DeGeneres Show came forward in private messages to journalists via open letters or anonymously through whistleblower portals. Some spoke of harassment, some spoke of mental health suppression. One wrote, "I watched a girl get iced out for calling HR. She went from supervising 10 people to sharing a desk with the mailroom guy. She had a panic attack. No one helped. Jasmine stood up for her." The hashtag "Let Jasmine Speak" became more than a trend. It became a campaign, a call, a rallying cry for media accountability and racial equity in corporate power structures. Protest signs popped up in Los Angeles, New York, and D.C. bearing the phrase, held by students, activists, and workers who had never seen themselves reflected in a moment of mainstream confrontation before. But amidst the storm, Jasmine remained still. She refused TV interviews. She declined op-eds. And that silence, so rare in a media age that rewards overexposure, gave her even more gravity. Commentators began referring to her as the woman who burned the studio down without raising her voice. A quote from her hearing resurfaced. "I'm not here to trend. I'm here to testify." Even within her own party, voices rose, some in praise, others in panic. "She didn't ask permission," one Democratic strategist said on Background. "She just walked in and told the truth on national TV. You can't bottle that. You can't control that." But while the political world debated, the cultural ground was shifting beneath their feet. For years, Ellen had been protected not by the truth, but by the illusion of truthfulness. Her smile, her "be kind" mantra, her celebrity allies. Jasmine Crockett didn't just challenge that illusion. She exposed it. The world didn't see a woman being attacked. It saw a woman being revealed. And Jasmine, calm, prepared, unapologetic, had held up the mirror. On the fifth day, a billboard went up in Times Square. It showed two images. One of Ellen, laughing on the old set in 2017, and another of Jasmine staring her down across the table in 2025. Across the middle, bold and clear, were the words, "Kindness isn't a slogan, it's accountability." And underneath, the hashtag, "Let Jasmine Speak." The show had ended, but not the story, not the wait, not the reckoning. And when Ellen turned to Jasmine backstage, voice low, hands trembling slightly, it was no longer the performer who spoke. It was the woman behind the curtain, stripped of applause, finally forced to face the silence she'd always choreographed away. They moved through the corridor like two shadows caught between worlds. Gone were the hot lights, the artificial cheer, the carefully edited moments built for broadcast. Here, behind the heavy door marked "Private," there were no producers, no cue cards, no studio audience waiting to laugh or cry on command. Just a small room with beige walls, two chairs, and the sound of a clock ticking too loudly in the corner. The door clicked shut behind them. For the first time all night, there was no one watching. And for Ellen, that was the most terrifying part. She stood for a moment, back straight, then sat down slowly, as if her body no longer trusted itself to move without scrutiny. Jasmine remained standing. Her arms were crossed, not in anger, in discipline, in control. She didn't come in here for closure. She came for clarity. Ellen spoke first, her voice hoarse and smaller than it had ever sounded under the lights. "I used to think I was one of the good ones." She looked down at her hands. "I thought that giving to charity, speaking out for animals, supporting a few causes, that made me decent." A long breath. "But I never listened. Not really. Not when it counted. I didn't hear the crying behind the doors. Or maybe I did. I just didn't want it to mess with the brand." Jasmine didn't move, didn't blink. She let the words settle, unfiltered, raw, without spin. This wasn't the Ellen who joked between segments. This was the Ellen who had looked away while others suffered in her shadow. Ellen looked up at her, eyes wet but not weeping. "I remember once, a girl from wardrobe sat outside my office for 2 hours. She was shaking, said she needed to talk. I told my assistant to reschedule her. I was too tired that day. She quit a week later. I never asked why." Jasmine finally stepped forward slowly and sat down across from her. Her voice, when it came, wasn't cruel. It was clean, sharp like a scalpel meant for truth, not punishment. "It's not enough to remember now." Ellen looked confused. "I'm not trying to excuse anything. I didn't know how far it all went." Jasmine held her gaze. "You didn't want to know." She leaned in slightly, her voice a level lower, more deliberate. "Because knowing would have meant choosing between comfort and accountability, between their pain and your peace." Ellen looked away, shame blooming slow and visible across her face. Jasmine continued, not out of anger, but necessity. "I've heard their stories. I've read their emails. I've looked into their eyes. Some of them still can't find work. Some of them still pay out of pocket for therapy. You built a machine that made kindness a currency. But when your people broke under that weight, you cashed out and blamed the floor they fell on." A long silence settled between them. Ellen finally whispered, "What do I do now?" Jasmine didn't hesitate. "You name them." Ellen blinked. "What?" "Each one," Jasmine said clearly. "You say their names, on camera, not in an Instagram caption, not hidden behind vague apologies about the team or the culture. You name the woman who was denied leave when her brother died. You name the man who was fired after his panic attack. You name the black producers you never once brought to the executive table, and the ones you quietly let go after the scandal broke." Ellen's face drained of all color. "But what if I don't remember them all?" Jasmine leaned back, calm, cold, and steady. "Then find someone who does, because they remember you." The clock ticked. A truck passed outside. The room felt like a courtroom caught between testimony and sentence. Ellen swallowed. Her voice broke slightly. "I'm scared." Jasmine didn't flinch. So were they. A beat. Every day for years. They were scared of speaking, scared of losing their jobs, scared of losing themselves. You built something that turned fear into a silent job requirement. Ellen looked like she'd aged 5 years in 5 minutes. She didn't argue. She didn't defend. She just nodded slowly, finally understanding the magnitude of what she had dismissed for so long. Jasmine stood up, smoothing the crease in her blazer. Before walking to the door, she looked back one final time. Redemption doesn't come from sitting in silence after the cameras are off. Her voice was soft, but iron hard. It comes from standing in the light and saying the names of the people who made your empire possible, even when you tried to erase them. Then she opened the door. The hallway outside was quiet. No applause, no headlines. Just the quiet hum of justice setting in. Slow, steady, and unmistakably real. Behind her, Ellen sat motionless, her reflection faint in the dressing room mirror. For the first time in her career, the mirror didn't show her a brand. It showed her what she'd become, and what she still had to do. What happened behind that closed door had changed something in Ellen, but it wasn't enough. Jasmine knew that apologies spoken in silence didn't heal wounds cut in public. So she returned to the stage, this time, not alone. The studio was quieter this time, not somber, not hostile, just reverent. The lighting had changed subtly, softer, less artificial. The stage no longer belonged to forgiveness dressed as performance. It had become a place of testimony. There were no monologues, no opening jokes, no warm-up comic. Just Jasmine Crockett, seated center stage, her posture composed, eyes steady, voice calm. She spoke into the microphone like she was addressing a courtroom, not a studio. Last week, the world saw a version of truth that was long overdue. But I believe in more than confrontation. I believe in correction. Today, we're not telling Ellen's story. We're telling the stories that never made it to the camera. The audience didn't applaud. They nodded, leaned forward, held breath. Then the lights shifted slightly, and 3 chairs were brought to the front of the stage. Jasmine rose from her seat and walked over, not as a host, but as a facilitator of truth. One by one, the guests entered. No celebrity fanfare, no graphics, no titles, just names and pain. The first was a black man in his mid-40s, wearing a dark blazer and a pin on his lapel, shaped like a clock. Time, it seemed, had taken something from him, but it hadn't broken him. He sat down, adjusted the mic, and cleared his throat. "My name is Marcus Hill. I used to be the logistics manager on The Ellen Show. 10 years, 10 hours a day, sometimes 14. He took a slow breath. "I was fired after I reported that one of my team members had collapsed from exhaustion. They told me I was creating unnecessary waves. A week later, I was gone." A murmur rippled through the room. He looked out into the audience, then turned toward Jasmine. "When I lost that job, I lost my house. I lost insurance. I lost the ability to look my kids in the eye and tell them this country protects the honest." His voice cracked, but he didn't cry. He sat taller. "And today I'm here because of a woman who never once asked me to shrink. A woman who didn't know me, but still chose to speak up for me." He turned his head slightly, just slightly, toward the back of the stage. The camera followed. Ellen sat there, in shadow, not as a guest, not as a star, just as someone who used to hold the power. She didn't speak. Marcus didn't look for her approval. He just exhaled and said, "For years I told the truth and paid the price. Today I get to tell it again. This time, without fear." The audience held their silence like a sacred object. Next came a woman in her 30s, Latina, sharp-eyed, shoulders tense. Her name was Elena Rivera, and she'd been an assistant producer. She held a folded piece of paper in her hands as she sat, not to read from, but to hold like armor. She unfolded it once, then didn't look down. "I was asked to smile through everything," she began, "through being passed over, through being told I was too passionate when I pitched stories, through being told not to bring up my mom's illness because it made people uncomfortable." She paused, her voice catching. "When I requested family leave to care for her, they said I wasn't essential enough to justify it. I was 28. She died that same year." A ripple of grief moved through the room. Elena steadied herself. "I haven't spoken about this on camera, ever. But I'm here now because someone with a bigger platform and a stronger will said, "You don't need permission to speak." Jasmine gave us that, not with her fame, but with her refusal to flinch. Then, the third guest, a soft-spoken white man in his early 50s, glasses, nervous hands. His name was Brian Lutz. He didn't work on camera. He worked in post-production. He spoke slowly, carefully. I edited the highlight reels, the ones everyone laughed at, the bloopers, the dancing. He gave a hollow smile. I also edited out crying interns, audio complaints, cut footage from people asking for help in the background. He looked directly at the audience. We erased it all because we were told this show is about joy. But it wasn't joy for us. It was fear. Fear of being fired if you hesitated. Fear of being branded difficult if you hesitated. So we didn't hesitate. We buried it, and it buried us back. A long, aching silence followed. Brian nodded once quietly. I'm here now because Jasmine pulled the footage back into the light. She gave us names, gave us space, gave us something no one behind that stage ever did. Dignity. Then Jasmine returned to her seat. She didn't wrap it up with a bow. She didn't summarize their pain with a tweetable quote. She just looked at the audience and said, "What you saw last week wasn't a gotcha moment. It was a mirror. These people deserve more than applause. They deserve acknowledgement, and they deserve it from the person who once erased them." The camera turned again. Ellen remained seated, head bowed, not in shame, at least not entirely, in recognition. And for the first time, she nodded, not as a host, as a listener. As the lights dimmed and the studio returned to stillness, no music played. No one clapped. And then, in that quiet tension, Ellen stood, not to defend, not to deflect, but to finally surrender the stage she once ruled. She rose like someone coming out of mourning, not for a person, but for an illusion. Her footsteps were soft, but each one felt final. The air was thick, not with anger or pity, but with gravity. She didn't carry notes. She didn't need a speech. She knew nothing she said would undo what had happened. But silence, too, could be a kind of dishonesty. When she reached the center of the stage, she didn't look at the audience first. She looked down at the floor where so many had stood before her, forgotten, silenced, erased. Then she looked up. "This will be my final appearance on television," she began, her voice quieter than anyone expected. "I'm not leaving because I was canceled. I'm leaving because, for the first time in my life, I know that being heard doesn't mean I've been right." A hushed ripple of breath moved through the crowd. Ellen blinked against the lights, those same lights that had once made her glow with invincibility. "For decades," she continued, "I convinced myself that generosity was enough. I donated. I danced. I said the right things on the right days. But I never sat still long enough to hear who I was failing." She swallowed hard. "I failed to protect the people who made this show possible. I failed to challenge my comfort. I failed to ask myself why so many tears fell behind the scenes while I smiled in front of them." She hesitated. Her hands twitched slightly at her sides, instinctively searching for something to hold. There was nothing but her own reckoning. "I thought I was the hero of this story, but I wasn't." That line landed like a confession carved into stone. It echoed in the room like the final click of a courtroom door. "I won't ask for applause. I won't ask for forgiveness. I'm not owed either. What I owe," she said, voice strengthening, "is the space I've taken. I'm going to step out of the spotlight, not out of shame, but out of responsibility. Because sometimes," her voice cracked again, "the kindest thing you can do is to shut up and listen." And with that, she stepped back. Not into the wings, just behind the camera, out of frame, out of focus. All eyes turned to Jasmine. She had remained motionless throughout, watching, measuring. Not Ellen's words, but their weight. Someone off stage motioned for her, a cue to speak, to close the show, to give the moment its television perfect ending. But Jasmine wasn't here to give endings. She was here to speak truth. She stood, straightened her blazer, and walked, not toward Ellen, but directly to the camera. "I've been thanked these last few days," she began, her tone cool and precise. But I need you all to understand something very clearly. She looked out into the crowd, then back into the lens. This is not about me. This has never been about me. She paced a step forward, grounding each word like a gavel on the studio floor. This is about the ones who went home shaking from humiliation and had to smile at their kids. The ones who spent years believing that abuse was the price of working somewhere famous. The ones who were made to feel invisible so others could feel important. She let the words breathe, then tightened her voice. It's about the people who were mocked for crying, who were told to toughen up or lighten up, depending on who was in the room. The ones who were called difficult when they said the truth out loud. The ones who lost jobs, health, and pieces of themselves to protect someone else's brand. Her next words were not loud, but they landed like thunder. They were erased. I came here to name them. The studio held its breath. You could hear it, feel it. No one was scrolling. No one was shifting in their seat. They were waiting, for once, for the quiet people to be seen. Jasmine didn't soften. I won't accept your gratitude because I didn't speak for you to feel better. I spoke so the silence couldn't lie anymore. She turned her head, only slightly, toward Ellen, who stood frozen at the edge of the set. If you want to know what real kindness looks like, Jasmine asked, it's when someone loses everything for telling the truth and still shows up anyway. She paused. Let that sit. Then gently she said, let this be the last time we mistake charm for character. With that, Jasmine stepped away from the camera, leaving behind a stage stripped of artifice, soaked in truth, and echoing with the voices it once tried to silence. The screen faded to black, not with music, but with names. A rolling list, hundreds of them, the ones who were never mentioned on air until now. The names faded, the lights never returned, and just when it seemed the world had shifted with her truth, Jasmine Crockett learned what history reserves for those who dare speak too loudly: consequences dressed as silence. Exactly 7 days later, Jasmine's phone stopped ringing, but not from lack of attention. It was deliberate. Studio after studio, talk show after talk show, suddenly found her too confrontational, too disruptive, too dangerous for daytime. Agents who had once bragged about knowing her began to change the subject when her name came up. The same producers who once chased her for exclusives now cited format changes and internal restructuring. She wasn't blacklisted. She was blanked out, quietly, efficiently, and without fingerprints. A friend from a major network texted her late one night, "They're calling you radioactive, even the progressive ones. They think you embarrass the system, not just Ellen." Jasmine didn't reply. She didn't have to. She knew. She had stared down the beast, and no beast forgives a mirror. But while the gatekeepers shut their doors, the public opened theirs. Within hours of airing, the full interview was uploaded online, not by the network, but by an independent journalist who had live-streamed the episode from the parking lot. It wasn't slick. It wasn't framed with headlines or commentary. Just the raw, uninterrupted video. By day 2, it hit 20 million views. By day 6, it overtook every trending topic on YouTube. By day 10, the count stood at 83 million and rising. Clips of Jasmine asking the unaskable flooded TikTok, captioned in 5 languages. Threads unpacking her rhetorical technique were pinned by law professors. A viral remix of her closing monologue over Hans Zimmer's Time soundtrack protest videos in 5 cities. People weren't just watching, they were remembering. One clip in particular, Jasmine's face lit only by the overhead rigging, her words laced with steel, began circulating with a simple title: "The Day Truth Didn't Blink." And somewhere in Los Angeles, in a quiet, cramped dormitory above a taqueria, a second-year media student named Maya Torres watched the full hour for the 3rd time. She had grown up on Ellen's show. Her mother had once pointed to the screen and said, "You see? That's what success looks like, being loved by everyone." But now Maya saw the cost of that kind of love. She saw the lies it demanded, the silence it fed on, the bodies it left behind. And for the first time in her short life, she picked up a pen and wrote a letter. Not a tweet, not a post. A letter on real paper, with trembling hands. Dear Ms. Crockett, you didn't just show me the truth. You showed me what it means to stand in it. You taught me that sometimes being good means being uncomfortable. Sometimes it means being hated. But it should never mean betraying yourself. She folded it carefully, sealed it, and taped it to the inside of her dorm closet door, where no one could see it yet. She wasn't ready to mail it. Not yet. But she was ready for something else. To stop apologizing for the questions she asked in class. Across the country, the ripple widened. In Chicago, a high school teacher printed out Jasmine's transcript and made it required reading for a civics unit on whistleblowers. In Atlanta, a local pastor cited her confrontation in a sermon titled, "The Gospel of Uncomfortable Truths." In a small town in Nebraska, a retired nurse gathered a group of former co-workers and said, "I think I was one of those people who laughed when others were crying. I think I need to change that." But Jasmine, she wasn't trending. She wasn't being booked. She wasn't basking in virality. She was alone. Her team had shrunk to one intern and a part-time assistant. Her inbox was flooded, but mostly with hate mail, legal threats, and 2 cease and desist letters from media firms demanding she cease unauthorized public distribution of trademarked content. Her name was a lightning rod. Her motives were dissected. One op-ed called her a performance arsonist addicted to outrage. Another warned, "There's a thin line between justice and vengeance. Crockett is dancing on it." She read none of them. Instead, she sat at her kitchen table at 2:14 a.m. Barefoot, her laptop open but idle, a cup of cold coffee half sipped, and stared at the city through her window. Not out of despair, out of clarity. This was never going to be applause. This was fire. And fire doesn't get thank yous. It gets used or feared. She looked over at a small stack of mail. One envelope stood out. No stamp, no return address, just handwriting. She picked it up, opened it, and unfolded the page. She read Maya's letter once, then again, then a third time. She didn't smile, but she whispered something just under her breath. That's why. 10 days after the video's release, a panel of anchors debated the fallout on national television. "Has Jasmine Crockett gone too far?" one host asked, glancing at the camera with a smirk. But the other guest, an older journalist with gray in her temples and truth in her eyes, looked directly at the lens and said, "No, I think Jasmine Crockett went exactly far enough. The rest of us just haven't caught up yet." And somewhere in that moment, between the silence of the studios and the roar of 83 million clicks, a seed was planted, not for fame, for change. Because long after the hashtags fade and the news cycle resets and the next celebrity scandal lights up the screen, there will be people like Maya, writing letters, remembering the woman who didn't flinch. A week of broadcast silence did not muffle the roar in Jasmine's ears. It only redirected the noise inward, into a private echo chamber where doubt, resolve, and a relentless, almost surgical curiosity about justice argued for space. The human lesson at the charred heart of this saga begins with a brutal acknowledgement. Charm can launder cruelty until everyone forgets to check the stains. Power often hides in plain sight because it arrives as a joke, a giveaway, a feel-good dance that makes the studio audience cheer while backstage hallways accumulate broken voices. Jasmine's on-air confrontation tore that illusion open, revealing that cruelty wrapped in a smile is still cruelty, and the sooner we name it, the sooner it begins to lose its camouflage. Silence, she discovered, isn't an empty space. It's a transaction. Every unspoken objection is a down payment on someone else's misery. The longer we defer the debt, the more interest it accrues in anxiety, ulcers, therapy bills, and funerals postponed because medical leave was inconvenient for production. Courage, therefore, must be noisy before it is polite. It must enter the room the way thunder enters a valley, without waiting for local approval ratings, because comforting the powerful has never emancipated the powerless. Kindness, if it is real, cannot be scheduled for sweeps week. It cannot be choreographed between ad breaks. It lives in forgotten moments when no one tweets, no one films, no one posts. And that is exactly why Jasmine refused to collect applause. She understood that gratitude offered too early can fossilize into permission to quit halfway up the mountain. Being good will cost you. It will cost you invitations to the soft seats and the sweet deals. It will cost you the lazy safety of unanimous rooms. It will cost you the illusion that you can do the right thing and still be universally beloved. Yet the price of betraying yourself is steeper, because that invoice never stops arriving at 3 in the morning. Anger, when aimed at oppression, is not the opposite of grace. It is grace dressed for combat. Jasmine's voice shook not from lack of composure, but from the gravitational pull of decades of muffled voices clustering at her vocal cords, demanding to be released. If that vibration unsettled polite society, then politeness was overdue for demolition. Redemption, contrary to every glossy rebrand, is not a comeback tour. It is an exile you volunteer for, where you sit in the wilderness long enough for your ego to starve and your empathy to develop calluses. Ellen's only path forward now leads away from the lights. Anything less would turn remorse into just another segment. Legacy, in the end, is authored by the most forgettable witnesses. Dorm room freshmen writing letters at 2 a.m., retired nurses who stop laughing at cruel jokes, middle schoolers who see through a viral clip and decide never to stay silent in a locker room hazing. And when their time comes, they shape the culture in directions the ratings departments never predicted. But the lesson does not stop at indicting old sins. It carries an instruction manual for everyone still clocked in inside imperfect systems. First, audit your laughter. Ask whether the joke requires someone else's invisible tears to land. If so, you are participating in a theft of dignity disguised as entertainment. Second, memorize the floor plan of your privilege. Know where the fire exits are, so you can drag others through when the building of hypocrisy inevitably catches flame. Jasmine mapped hers, then kicked the door off its hinges in real time. Third, practice the subtle art of refusal. Refuse to retweet empty apologies. Refuse to confuse donations with restitution. Refuse to edit out the wobble in a survivor's voice because it kills the vibe. Fourth, develop a palate for discomfort. The truth is rarely served at a comfortable temperature. It scalds, it chills, it unsettles the gut. But cultivated discomfort is the only seasoning that keeps moral taste buds from going numb. Fifth, treat visibility like a loan from the voiceless. If the spotlight ever turns your way, remember you are accruing interest every second you forget the people who paid for the bulb. Sixth, redefine winning. Jasmine did not win a trophy. She detonated a narrative. Victory looked like job offers evaporating, ratings plummeting, and a wave of quiet survivors finally whisper shouting, "Me too," at their reflections. Seventh, take notes in the dark. Change rarely files its paperwork in daylight. It scribbles possibilities on backs of envelopes after midnight. And those scribbles, letters from Maya, classroom debates, sermons that sting, become blueprints for revolutions disguised as coursework. Eighth, remember that systems do not fear apologies. They fear organization. 83 million views are impressive, but 83 million voters, donors, whistleblowers, and boardroom question askers are history-bending. Every share button is a recruitment post for the next confrontation. Ninth, reserve space for the imperfect ally. Ellen's failure was colossal, but growth, if sincere, requires proximity to the rubble. Banishment without rehabilitation teaches bystanders that repentance is impossible. And if redemption is impossible, cowardice becomes rational. So build narrow bridges, guard them fiercely, but leave just enough room for the prodigal to limp back without a camera crew. 10th, protect your mirror at all costs. Empires pour millions into fog machines that blur reflections. Keep your glass clean, your lighting brutal, your willingness to start over intact. Because the day you stop recognizing yourself is the day you begin auditioning for a role you promised you'd never play. Finally, stitch these principles together with a thread as unglamorous as it is indestructible. Consistency. Speak when no one is trending, give credit when no one is filming, correct yourself when no one is clapping, and refuse the bargain of selective empathy that says some tears are content and others are noise. If the broadcast booths label you too intense, wear it like a medal. If advertisers pull their dollars, remember that the truth has always been crowdfunded by the stubborn hearts of ordinary people who pass notes in class and letters in dorms. Jasmine Crockett walked into a studio built on applause and left it covered in echoes. She showed the world that maps drawn by power can be redrafted if one person refuses to erase the marginalized to fit the frame. That is the human lesson. Real change moves at the speed of courage, and courage is nothing more than the daily decision to be allergic to complicity. So the next time silence offers you a discount on comfort, remember Jasmine, remember Maya, remember 83 million eyes watching a woman refuse to blink. Then ask yourself if you are willing to pay the full price of being fully, ferociously human. The story's embers are still hot beneath your feet, and if you listen closely, you can hear them ticking like buried mines, daring you to step forward and finish what Jasmine began. Stand up now, literally rise from whatever chair, couch, subway seat, or fluorescent-lit cubicle you're inhabiting, and feel the weight of your own body taking back gravity, because this moment is not a vignette for casual consumption, but a live fuse wired straight to every system that trades human dignity for ratings, profits, or a comfortable shrug. And the first act of rebellion is refusing to remain seated while that fuse burns beneath someone else's skin. Open a browser and type the name of a worker rights organization in your city, sign their petition, donate $5, $10, whatever the cost of silence has been for you. Then share the link not with a lazy repost, but with a personal note that says, "I'm done applauding politely while people bleed off screen," because algorithms may bury generic outrage, but they cannot mute a confession written in your own fingerprints. Pick up your phone, scroll to the bottom of your contacts, and text the quietest person you know at work. Yes, the intern who stacks coffee orders, the night janitor who hums alone down the hallway, the volunteer who never speaks in meetings, and ask them how the place really feels after the lights go off. Then close your mouth and listen without fixing, pivoting, or translating their pain into a networking opportunity. Because solidarity starts with creating a vault where the overlooked can pour their unedited truth. And once that vault is full, you carry it, brick by brick, into the next staff meeting and refuse to let the minutes conclude until their words are inscribed in the official record. If you belong to a house of worship, a book club, a fantasy sports chat, any circle that gathers humans out of habit, hijack the next agenda and play a 5-minute clip of Jasmine's interrogation. Yes, the part where Ellen tries to swallow the truth and chokes on silence. Then ask the room who in your shared sphere has been paying the hidden tax of keeping the vibe positive. Because scenes of televised courage are useless if they die on the screen. So resurrect that courage in every sanctuary, basement, and bar, and dare your friends to name one concrete policy they will change in their own domain before the week is out. Email your local school board and demand that media literacy curricula include not just the heroic narratives of journalistic triumph, but the darker chapters where laughter was weaponized against the powerless. And cite the 83 million view case study as proof that teenagers can deconstruct gatekeeping if we supply the lenses. Attach a lesson plan if you have 5 minutes, because bureaucracy stalls on vagueness, but panics when handed specifics, and every classroom that watches Jasmine's composure under fire becomes a seedbed of future whistleblowers who will not stop the recording when authority clears its throat. Turn your social media feed into a ledger of accountability. Whenever a brand tweets about kindness, pull their 10K labor disclosures and quote employee churn rates in the replies. Link watchdog investigations beneath their pastel PR posters, and tag consumer rights groups until companies realize that every hashtag they coin can be flipped into a subpoena for receipts. Because the marketplace only fears one thing more than boycotts: receipts that trend. If you work anywhere with an HR portal, file a formal request asking how mental health leave is logged, who signs off, and what percentage of requests are denied. Then screenshot the unanswered ticket and schedule a recurring calendar reminder every 30 days until data surfaces, because persistence is activist oxygen and corporations count on your fatigue. If the answers arrive toothless, forward them to a journalist, a union organizer, or the world, because transparency withheld is complicity extended, and the clock is already running on the next invisible breakdown in a stairwell like the one Jasmine exposed. Commit right now to a 6-month plan of consuming one story a week from people you normally scroll past, frontline domestic workers, asylum seekers, disabled creators explaining the hidden fees of ableism, and keep a journal of how each testimony recalibrates your reflexes. Because empathy without documentation evaporates into sentiment, whereas empathy recorded becomes a map you can hand to the next traveler stumbling through the tunnel of "I never knew," and those maps, multiplied, harden into roads that lawmakers are eventually forced to pave. When election season swells with slogans about civility, remember Jasmine's trembling cup of truth and ask each candidate in your district to define kindness without using the words charity, civility, or smile. If they cannot, record the silence and post the clip. For silence, once published, is louder than any stump speech, and no official deserves your vote if they cannot differentiate between a photo op donation and the slow grind of structural repair. Finally, pledge, out loud, maybe awkwardly, to break your personal algorithm. Swap 1 hour of doom scrolling for calling a state representative. Replace one comfort show binge with volunteering at a worker center hotline. Exchange one self-congratulatory meme for printing a flyer that lists mental health resources and pinning it to the break room corkboard at 7 a.m. before anyone can peel it down. Because revolutions are not thunderclaps born in capitals. They are barn fires started in the most ordinary fields when one match refuses to be blown out. And if, by nightfall, that still feels small, remember Maya Torres taping her letter inside a dorm closet, an act unseen, unretweeted, yet potent enough to fracture the sound barrier between resignation and resolve. Then imagine 50,000 Mayas reading the same call, taping their own letters, and realizing their closets are temporary storage for the megaphones they are destined to build. Your single step adds flooring to their stage. So move now while the coals are hot and let the world feel the shudder of a million tiny actions, converging into the one headline every abuser dreads. The silence is overbooked. We suggest you speak now. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.